So let's look at the unit circle. So we're going to take a look at trigonometric values for special angles to help fill in the unit circle. So knowing these will greatly help us out in filling out the unit circle. So we're looking at 30, 60, 90 triangles and the 45, 45 triangles as well. So let's look at sine of 30. Now sine, remember, is opposite over hypotenuse. Cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse. Tangent is opposite over adjacent, and then we have our reciprocals. So looking at sine of 30, we know that is opposite 1 over hypotenuse, which is 2. 1 over 2. And then let's continue on with cosine of 30 degrees. So cosine is adjacent, that is root 3 over the hypotenuse 2. Tangent is opposite over adjacent, so that's 1 over root 3, or that simplifies to root 3 over 3. So let's find the cosecant. Cosecant is a reciprocal, so that's 2. Secant, that is a reciprocal, so that's going to be 2 over root 3, or that's 2 root 3 over 3. And then cotangent, we see, is just root 3. Let's look at 60 degrees, just to fill that out. So 60 degrees right here. And then so opposite, it's going to be root 3 over 2. Cosine is 1 over 2. And then tangent is square root of 3. And then cosecant is the reciprocal, and so that is going to be 2 root 3 over 3. And then secant is a reciprocal, so that is 2. And then we have the cotangent, which is going to be root 3 over 3. Last, let's look at 45 degrees. So sine of 45, that is going to be 1 over root 2, or root 2 over 2. Cosine, it's the same thing, so it's root 2 over 2. And then tangent is 1 over 1, so that's 1. Cosecant is root 2, secant is root 2, and cotangent is also 1. So looking at these values, we're going to fill in the unit circle. And so these are the units that you really need to memorize. And there's a certain piece of it that you can memorize, and then you can figure out the rest from there. So a couple things on here. Immediately we know this is 0, we'll do radians, 0 radians, and then 2 pi. So 0, and then up here is pi over 2, this is pi, and down here is 3 pi over 2. Now, looking at, this is the unit circle, so at this point here at 0, or 2 pi, x is 1 and y is 0. Then at the top, x is 0, y is 1, and at pi, we're at x is negative 1, y is 0, and then down below, this is 0, negative 1. So those are our quadrantal angles, and so that's pretty fast to figure out, and this is 0 degrees. So now let's take a look at the pi over 2. Let's fill out some radians. Pi over 2, this is actually going to go backwards. This is pi over 3, pi over 4, and pi over 6. Now looking at degrees, if this is 0 degrees, this is going to be our 30 degrees, 30 and 45 degrees, 60 degrees, and 90 degrees. Okay, so if we know the first quadrant, we're actually pretty good. So let's take a look at our first quadrant. There is a little trick to this. So if we know that sine is 0, okay, so let's look at 0 degrees or 0 radians, or let's do degrees, 0 degrees, 30 degrees, 45 degrees, 60 degrees, and 90 degrees. We have sine, which is y, cosine is x. So what is sine at 0 degrees? Well, that is 0. And then what we can do is we can do it in order. Sine is 0, then we go 1, 2, 3, 4, and then go backwards at cosine, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. The next thing you do would you take the square root of each value. So this is kind of to help you out with the values of these before you get them memorized. So once you do that, then you divide by 2 last. Okay, so that's just to make sure that's not inside the square root. Then the last thing you do is you simplify, and this gives us all the values in quadrant 1. So sine of 0 is going to be 0, then this simplifies to 1/2, and then root 2 over 2 is the same, root 3 over 2 is the same, and then what is root 4 over 2? Well, that is 1. Same thing for cosine. Root 4 over 2 is just 1, and then down here, cosine of 60 is 1/2, and then over here, this is also 0. So knowing these, we can fill out our table. Now, another thing is if you remember that sine is 0, this just increases by 1. So this is 1, this is 2, this is 3, and up here, this is our 4. And then it goes backwards. So 0, 1, 2, 3, and then 4. And if you just know this part, just know the values. It's 1 over 2, and this one therefore is square root of 3 over 2. This one's root 2 over 2. So the pi over 4, anything with 4 in the denominator, is going to be that 45-degree angle, the root 2 over 2. And then looking at pi over 3, root 3 over 2, and 1/2. And so this is quadrant 1. After that, we're looking at all our reference angles. So really, if you just get one of these memorized, whichever one you decide, it really will help you out in, recalling some of these things really quickly. So I like to look at it as if I'm looking at cosine of 30 or pi over 6, I think that is closest to the x-axis, right? So therefore, if it's closest to the x-axis, the x is closer to the x, then that's going to be my higher value of root 3 over 2. Okay, or if it's the y value at 30 degrees, that's further from the y value, so it's the lower one, 1/2. Whatever helps you to memorizing the unit circle. And really, if you think about just looking at memorizing, like 30 degrees and maybe 60 degrees, then, knowing the reference angles, that will help you out. Let's go ahead and fill out the rest of this unit circle. And so we have pi over 2. We want to fill out the rest of the radians on the left side. That's probably the harder part to do that. We know that the reference angle here, that has to do with our 30 degrees. So one way that I think about that is that I have pi and then pi over 6. So in order to find this value here, I think about pi minus pi over 6. So that's 6 pi over 6. So this ends up being 5 pi over 6. We do the same thing for pi over 4. So therefore, we subtract pi over 4 from pi over, we subtract pi from pi over 4. So therefore, we get 3 pi over 4. And then for pi over 3, so pi minus pi over 3 will be 2 pi over 3. Then for down in quadrant number 3, I think about adding that reference angle to pi. So for example, this is going to be our 30 degrees here, adding pi over 6. So I'm going to take pi plus pi over 6. This is going to be 7 pi over 6. Then for the pi over 4, that's going to be 5 pi over 4. Then down here, it will be over 3. So this is going to be 4 pi over 3. Getting to the other side of the unit circle, so in quadrant 4, I think about taking 2 pi minus, for example, the pi over 6 for this angle here. So that is end up going to be 11 pi over 6, then 2 pi minus pi over 4, that is going to be 7 pi over 4. Then down here, this will be 5 pi over 3. So hopefully that helps you out in filling out the other quadrants. And now we just have to fill in the trig values for here. Now remember that this has to do with the pi over 6. So the radians are really nice because anything with 6 is going to have the root 3 over 2 and 1/2. We just have to figure out the signs. So all the x values are negative here, so it's the same one. So this is going to be negative root 2 over 2 over root 2 over 2. Then the x value here is going to be negative 1/2, and this is root 3 over 2. So I'm sure you can figure out how to fill out the rest of these just by looking at the reference angles here. Pi over 6, so anything with pi over 6 will be here, negative root 3 over 2 and negative 1/2. And then down here, negative root 2 over 2. This is negative 1/2 and negative root 3 over 2. On the right, this is positive 1/2. And this is root 3 over 2. This is positive root 2 over 2 and negative root 2 over 2. The y value is negative. And this is root 3 over 2 and negative 1/2. Then we can fill out the degrees, but mainly, again, we're going to focus on the radians. So I hope this helps you out. Again, if you're having trouble with memorizing these, you can always make a table real quick, and that can help you out for a little while, but eventually you want to memorize all of these values.